No. No, you can't just say that. You think I'm gonna buy that?
Diana, she was streetwise, but at the same time naive when it came to relationships.
19-year-old Diana Desso is having boy trouble. She graduated a few months back, but hasn't been much inclined to go to college or move out of her parents' house.
I'm still going out, and I don't care. No, what are you talking about, Mike?
She was a kid who lived in a neighborhood where you stood up for yourself or you ended up taking up a lot of abuse, and she wasn't afraid to stand up for herself. She didn't take grief from anybody.
You're damn right you'll be sorry. And I don't care. What do you mean you have to go to work? No, we did not talk about that.
It's Mike again.
Her parents, Jim and Marianne Desso, were hoping Diana would find a summer job. Instead, she's found herself a garage mechanic named Michael Pullman.
I'm not doing this now, babe. I got customers here. Seriously, what's your problem?
The boyfriend, Michael Pullman, was a individual that was a bit older than she.
Okay.
He had a bad history, and everybody knew, well, you're basically not a nice guy.
Yes, I was listening.
I didn't care for him, and I told her that, but it doesn't matter. What I think or what anybody else thinks is what she thinks.
You got something to say? Come down here and say it to my face. Hey, Mikey, over here, check this out. They need me, I gotta go.
Mike, we're gonna talk about this now. Hello? Mike? I'm gonna kill him.
I'm gonna go see what's going on in there.
Diana, are you okay?
I didn't get the whole gist of the conversation, but, she wasn't happy.
Ah!
Who knows?
She was still trying to find herself, but I thought that in time that she would, Some people take longer than others. Some people know what they want, when they're 10 or 11. Other people don't find out until they're 25 or 30, so, that's the way she was. And being a free spirit, she had to find herself first before she found out what she wanted to do.
Thing is, Diana's never gotten her driver's license, so she relies on her mother to drive her wherever she needs to go.
Diana, you ready, hon?
The plan is to spend the night at her grandmother's.
Hey, Mom, on our way to Grandma's community.
Diana, I am not driving you to that garage to see that man.
I need to talk to him, Mom.
He is nothing but trouble.
Yeah, I know that, Mom. I know you think he's a loser, but this is my life.
Baby, I just wish you would steer clear of him.
I'm so pissed at him right now, you just might get your wish.
Please. Fine, but only for a quick visit. Grandma's expecting us for dinner.
But when she gets to the garage, Diana has a surprise in store.
Michael, what the hell?
Excuse me a moment. Diana, what are you doing here?
I thought I'd surprise you. Who the hell is that?
It's a customer. I'm working here.
I can see you're working it.
Oh my God, you have no idea what you're talking about.
Michael, what the hell after what you just said to me?
What do you want me to do?
Diana, let's go. We're not done here.
I'll call you, okay? You have no idea what you're talking about.
I'm gonna be out. I'll call you.
Jealousy kind of set in with her, and she wasn't a happy camper after that.
That night, from her grandmother's, Diana calls Michael again. And again.
Michael, I'm sorry. You have to call me back. I'm not gonna stop calling until you do.
Diana's behavior was somewhat typical for an adolescent girl. I think she was very attracted to him and thought she was in love with him.
Di? What in the world are you doing?
I just need to get out for a bit.
Baby, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. Where are you gonna go at this hour?
Mama, please, I need to see him. I just need a ride over to Central Avenue. I know he's there.
Don't be crazy. I have to work tomorrow.
Diana, I am not going to drive you off in the middle of the night to look for your stupid boyfriend.
Fine. I'll go myself. Thanks for all your help.
Diana! Diana! Get back here! Diana!
She's questioning everything that happened earlier, and that's just putting fuel on the fire for her to get to him more than ever, you know? And there wasn't any way that I was going to stop her. She was intent on seeing him no matter what.
Diana, get back here!
That's a good boy.
The next day, a young man and his dog are enjoying a morning romp on an empty stretch along the eastern bank of the Hudson River.
That particular area of the Hudson River is not developed. There was a dirt road that was the only access in.
It was pretty much known locally that it was a place kids would go for beer parties or lovers would go to meet.
The thing is, what happens in the Hudson sometimes doesn't stay in the Hudson.
Miss? Hello? Ma'am?
Go and see if anyone's reported a missing person matching her description.
I found something. Fibers from a blanket or something. And this. Dog hair. Dog hair? No, not his. These are black. Let me bag these. All right, get what you can. Let's take her back to the corner.
An autopsy will confirm that the young woman was strangled to death. But that's not all.
When Diana was found, she was fully clothed. There were no injuries to suggest that a sexual assault had necessarily occurred.
And yet, there are traces of semen in her undergarments.
Which raised other questions. Was it a consensual sexual encounter? Was it a forced sexual encounter? Exactly what did happen to Diana that evening?
That same day, Marianne Desso returns from work only to learn that Diana still hasn't come home.
Please call me if you hear anything at all. Anything. Thanks. Still nothing.
You want to run by the garage again?
Maybe we should call the police.
You know, she's with him somewhere.
I don't know what to do.
She's a big girl, Mayor. She's gonna be okay.
Damn it, Diana.
Mayor!
What? What is it?
I was watching the 11 o'clock news, and they said that they had found someone on the East Greenbush side of the river. And I'm going, oh my God, right? And I mean, you're in disbelief. So we called the state police.
Mrs. Desso, did this belong to your daughter?
So one of them showed me her brush, and I knew. And I said, oh my God, this, you know, this doesn't happen.
Oh, God.
You're like in a fog, you know, and you're running on adrenaline and answering questions and trying to remember everything that went on.
Please, God.
I know this is hard, but could you tell us the last time?
That man, he did this to her.
Who?
"19-year-old Diana Desso has turned up dead on the muck-covered shores of the Hudson River.
That man, he did this to her.
Who?
Michael Pullman.
He killed our baby. You have got to go out and get him. No, please.
And the very next morning, police do just that.
Michael! Are you Michael Pullman?
Yeah.
I'm Detective Murray, this is Detective Fragamini. Just want to ask you a few questions.
This is about Diana, isn't it?
Yeah, what do you know about it?
Well, I mean, nothing. We spoke on the phone a little while back.
Do you know anything about that?
No,
You understand, we need to know exactly where you were Wednesday night.
I mean, I was home Wednesday night.
You were home Wednesday night. Never saw her?
No, I mean, no, but we spoke on the phone. She was pissed at me, but I never saw her.
Never took her for a little rendezvous down by the river?
During an interview, Michael told us that he had never been in that area and didn't know how to get there or where it was.
And can anyone vouch for you that you were home all night?
Yeah, my girlfriend.
Don't go too far.
Well, he was promiscuous because we know that he was living with a woman and that he was seeing Diana, and they caught him in a relationship with another woman earlier in that afternoon. So his character was definitely in question.
Hold on.
Later, when they check out Michael's story, they get another surprise.
I'm Detective Fragamini. This is Detective Murray. We'd like to ask you a few questions, please.
The mom-to-be says Michael was home with her all night.
Sorry I can't be more helpful.
What do you think?
I think it's a little convenient. Truth, I think she's covering for Daddy.
Mike had some scrapes with the law, and he had a temper. So, it became one of our theories at some point. What's the possibility that, Mike, in a fit of anger, may have assaulted and killed her?
Detective Murray heads over to the garage to check on his alibi.
Excuse me, Detective Murray, do you know a Michael Pullman?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're trying to figure out where he was Wednesday night.
Wednesday night. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I saw him out. Definitely.
We did find a few people that reported seeing him out that evening, even though he initially told us that he didn't go out. So our belief was that he was lying.
Could you describe his truck for me?
Older model. Black truck. Can't mistake it.
It was a somewhat of a homemade tow truck.
And this was where?
Down off of I-80. Across the bridge.
Thanks, man.
The person who said that they had seen a truck in the scene where the body was recovered that was somewhat unusual. And it was described very similar to the one Michael had.
Maybe Diana did find Michael that night.
The timeline could fit. We know that she had left the house, and we also know that he was out in his truck about that same time.
One way to find out is to execute a search warrant on Michael's truck. They find no signs of violence, but they do find something.
Look here.
A blanket?
And a lot of dog hair. Similar to the ones I bagged at the crime scene.
If the hairs match, it could prove that when Diana stormed out of the house looking for Michael, she found him.
We knew that Diana was upset with him and agitated, and that her reaction was to go and find him that night.
As word spreads about the young woman's murder, tips start flooding in.
Say that again? And can you remember what she was wearing? Jeans, red top. Yeah, that sounds like her.
She was observed walking along Central Avenue by friends of hers. They had seen her walking along and hitchhiking on Central Avenue.
She was on that street.
So she was hitchhiking?
I don't know. Her mother was pretty sure she'd never get in a car with a stranger.
But maybe she knew who was picking her up.
She never did get home. She was obviously picked up by someone.
So what was she doing walking out there? It's near the highway.
You know, that's where Karen Wilson was.
Who?
Maybe 2 years ago, that girl who disappeared. She was last seen at the corner of Central and Fuller. Same spot, practically. Same age, practically.
Think it's related?
I don't know.
Karen Wilson was a SUNY college student that was preparing for spring break. She was actually a legislative aide to the New York State Legislature working for one of the assembly persons. She was out getting last-minute preparations done when she vanished.
Here we go.
So she was last seen on Central near Fuller heading home from the gym, and she also disappeared?
Yep. And they never found a body. It's still an open case. They think she was hitchhiking.
Karen Wilson, we've never found her body. The fact that there were two young ladies picked up along the same area, from the same area. We were looking for any link between the two.
Any suspects in that one?
I think Jeffrey Williams. And there's an address.
To local police, Jeffrey Williams is what you'd call a known quantity.
Well, Jeffrey Williams was known to be an individual who was involved in attacks on young women.
Jeffrey Williams? Are you Jeffrey Williams? I'm Detective Fragamini from the North Greenbush PD.
What now? Working here.
Right. I'm gonna need you to step outside for a minute.
Can I get my jacket?
Sure.
Every time. You guys come knocking for every little thing.
Jeffrey served time before for sexual assault and was a suspect in an unsolved murder.
Jeff Williams was a local guy who many investigators believed were involved in more than just that. So Jeff became, because he had victimized women, became a prime suspect in any case involving women.
What is this about?
You seen this girl? You seen this girl?
No. Never seen her.
Can you tell me what you were doing last Wednesday night?
The night before she turned up murdered on the shores of the Hudson River, Diana Desso was spotted just blocks away from Jeffrey Williams, a known sexual predator.
I was working. Past midnight. Look, you can check my time card. I was here.
Interesting, because at about 12:45 was the last time this girl was seen. Just around the corner from here.
Listen?
Murdered. You want to maybe take a closer look at this?
At some point there had been a conversation with him about a bunch of women in the area, and Jeff might have reacted when Diana's name was brought up. There were people who felt strongly that it was possible. Jeffrey was definitely a good suspect.
Hey, Fragamini.
What you got?
Lab results on those blanket fibers and dog hairs.
From Michael's truck.
They match. A freaking microscopic match. We can prove she was in his truck.
Can we prove when, though?
There was trace evidence found on Diana, fibers and hair from a blanket that was in his truck.
He's not a nice person, but I don't know whether or not he's capable of such a thing. I didn't want to believe that anybody would be.
You got nothing. And the reason you got nothing is because I didn't do it.
Come on, Mike. We found dog hairs on her body and in your truck.
So? What does that prove? She rode my truck a bunch of times. I mean, I guess she should have done her laundry more often.
That in itself was a little compelling, but it wasn't definitive that she was in the truck that night.
But we've also got a witness who says he saw your truck out that night, not far from the river. Does your girlfriend know you went out?
Look, if we're talking Wednesday, late night, you know, I think I did go out for a couple hours after midnight. I was looking to pick up a couple of tow jobs.
Really? Yeah. Did you find anybody to tow?
No, it was quiet.
His story was that he had gone out to look for some tow jobs, which didn't make a lot of sense. In the middle of the night, normally you'd get a phone call on that. It wouldn't be just scouring the area for tow jobs.
We know you went out Wednesday night in your truck, and it wasn't to tow any cars. Did you kill Diana Deso?
I never saw her. Is that clear enough for you?
Well, we know she had sex that night, and if it wasn't with you, maybe you're not the only one with a complicated love life.
Look, I don't know, okay? I can't explain that. All I know is it wasn't me.
And I think you're lying.
And I care this much what you think. Can I go now?
Then prove it. Come back in for a polygraph. Just a few simple yes/no questions. You up for that?
You know, if it'll get you guys off my back, absolutely.
It doesn't take long to get the results from Michael's lie detector test.
Thanks, Brad. I'll be damned.
What do you got?
He passed. He's not lying.
Maybe we just didn't ask him the right questions.
It did not mean that he didn't do it. It was a tool that indicated that he may have been telling us the truth, but he still could have been lying to us and he could have been responsible.
The obvious person was Mike. As a mother and a parent, you're saying to yourself, well, listen, my child's gone and this person's walking around, and what are you going to do about it? And they said to me, we have to have rock solid evidence. Otherwise, there's nothing we can do.
Weeks go by, then months. Winter arrives, but an answer to the mystery of Diana's murder does not.
Although Michael Pullman still was a viable suspect, there was no new evidence that would link him to it. There was not enough evidence to arrest him, so the case did become a cold case.
You go to bed at night thinking, when is this going to end? I mean, there is no end, actually. You have to go on for your other kids and stuff. That's basically what I did. You don't have a choice. You can't, curl up in a ball and say, well, I can't go on anymore. It's not a decision.
"11 years pass. Detective John Murray becomes New York State investigator John Murray. A lot changes, but there's no statute of limitations on murder, and Diana Deso's case continues to haunt him.
You like to bat 1,000 when you're doing these investigations. You have a murder of a 19-year-old girl. You would certainly like to be able to solve it, get the person who did it. For a number of reasons, you would like to get the person punished for what he had done to this girl and hopefully prevent him from doing it to someone else.
Detective Murray always suspected it was Michael Pullman, and a decade after the murder, he finds a woman he hopes can help him prove it. Dr. Allison Eastman of the New York State Forensic Medical Center is very good at what she does.
Forensics, Dr. Eastman.
And what she does is DNA.
Yes. I was given the case, and it was one of the first cases that I did using that DNA technology. From 1987? It should still work. Bring it on by, we'll take a look.
We did have some biological evidence on her underclothing, and that's the specimen that Dr. Eastman was eventually able to get a DNA profile on.
All right.
In 1987, that DNA sample on Diana's body only confirmed that she had sex with somebody. But now, it might just tell them who that somebody was.
Ready?
You know, if you guys didn't have a warrant, there's no way I'd watch it with that. Ow!
This won't take long.
Detective John Murray has long suspected Diana's boyfriend, Michael Pullman. Now, a sample of his DNA will help prove it.
I firmly believed at the time we would then have the evidence we needed to make the arrest.
And that's 100%. I see. No. Yeah. No, you keep it, okay? Keep me posted. Thanks for calling, Dr. Eastman.
Michael Pullman's DNA is not a match.
It was a blow to what I thought was the case that pretty much eliminated our chances of arresting Michael.
I just will never forget how disappointed the investigators were when he was excluded. It was so disappointing. It broke my heart.
In a case like this, what we were looking at is what were the possibilities that if Michael Pullman was still involved in the homicide, that there was some reason for this DNA being with Diana that may be not related to her death.
I think people had to regroup a bit and process the new information that he was not the contributor of the profile. He was not the person that she had had a sexual encounter with.
It's looking like they've hit another dead end. Except for one thing, Dr. Allison Eastman won't give up.
You know, there are cases that haunt me. She was kind of like me when I was that age. I lived down in Albany. I used to walk around at night all by myself. I used to hitchhike and get in a car with people I didn't know. And I was lucky. I was very lucky. Diana was not.
Over the years, each time DNA technology improves, Dr. Eastman retests the sample from Diana's clothes. There's no national database yet, so she can only compare the DNA sample from Diana's body to a few potential suspects at a time.
I just remember doing a lot of those reference samples. It's, oh, here comes another sample. Could you compare it against the profile from Diana? And, you know, I always had that case on my desk. You know, you get your hopes up, too. You think, this is going to be the one.
Have you seen this girl?
Over the years, whenever Dr. Eastman finds even a partial match, investigators follow up.
Sure.
You know, it became important for us to try it all, you know, any way we could to identify who that DNA contributor was. But everywhere we went, we weren't able to rule anybody definitively in.
By 2004, the original sample is almost gone. But Dr. Eastman has a new weapon in her arsenal. The state of New York is developing a DNA database. There's only one problem.
The format that was used to enter these results was different than the test that was initially done on the Desso case.
Which means Dr. Eastman will have to use the last of the DNA.
It was the last try. There was hardly anything left. I had no DNA extract left.
If there isn't a match now, there never will be.
And what did you do then, Ray?
I had to get her out of there. Make it all go away.
He was hoping the brackish waters of the Hudson would carry her away and hide all traces of his crime. But the river had other ideas.
What happens to me now?
Now you gotta face up for what you did.
You're being charged with the murder of Diana Desso.
It's taken 17 years, but they've finally found Diana's killer.
Despite the hundreds of leads that were run and probably well over 100 suspects or witnesses that were interviewed, there was absolutely no connection between the killer and our victim except for a chance encounter that she happened to be walking down a road that he was driving.
The thing that stands out to me about this case is how long it went on.
In the end, Ray Keller pleads guilty to murder in the second degree, and on top of his current 25-year sentence, he gets another 22 years to life in state prison.
He wrote me a letter. He said he was sorry. You're not sorry. I'll never forgive you, you know. And a lot of people say, well, I forgive you. Well, that's not me. No. I don't forgive anybody for that.
As for Michael Pullman, well, the cloud of suspicion hanging over him is finally lifted.
Said, well, we just put Michael Pullman through the ringer for nothing. I guess he didn't deserve to have that happen.
I don't know. It's like a missing piece.
The house stood with the kind of dignity that makes silence feel heavier. It rose above the cold New Jersey ground, like a promise made by another century. A mansion with dark shutters, long windows, and enough rooms to hide a family's private weather from the world in autumn. When the leaves around it turned brittle and brown, the place looked almost theatrical, as if it had been built to hold a story too large for ordinary walls. The air around it carried the smell of damp soil, chimney smoke from neighboring homes, and the first warning of winter. Inside, there were polished surfaces, framed pictures, church music in memory, and the routines of a family that, from the outside, still appeared orderly. But some houses do not creak because they are old. Some creak because they are carrying too much. Before anyone knew what had happened in Westfield, before the nation learned the name John List, with that special kind of disbelief reserved for the seemingly respectable, there was only the impression of a family living behind drawn curtains. A father under pressure, a mother trying to hold her shape inside a narrowing life, children growing in the ordinary confusion of adolescence, and an elderly woman fading into the habits of age. There was no storm breaking over the roof that neighbors could point to and say there. That was the moment it all began. There was only the slow accumulation of things that do not announce themselves clearly at first. Financial humiliation, religious severity hardened into private doctrine, resentment wrapped in politeness, fear disguised as discipline, and a mind that had begun arranging other people's lives as though they were pieces on a board meant to answer only to him. It is one of the most unsettling features of certain crimes that they do not arrive wearing the face the public expects. They do not come through the front door with shouting, drunken chaos, or the twitching instability of a man already recognized as dangerous. They arrive in pressed shirts. They sit in church pews. They balance checkbooks until there is nothing left to balance. They carry themselves with the flattened courtesy of men who believe that control is virtue. And when they finally act, the action seems to leap out of a life that, in hindsight, was full of cracks no one knew how to measure. John List was the kind of man people might forget even while speaking to him. He did not move through the world with flamboyance or charm. He was serious, contained, restrained to the point of chill. His life had the outer structure of duty. Husband, father, churchgoer, provider. Yet duty, in some men, becomes a stage on which pride plays the holiest role. Failure is not experienced as pain alone, but as contamination. As a stain no confession can clean. For List, Money troubles were not simply numbers turning hostile. It became evidence that he was losing command of the image he believed he had been appointed to maintain. Employment faltered, debt deepened. Appearances remained. The family continued living in a large home that symbolized a status he could no longer support. Bills accumulated in the shadows of formal rooms. The distance between the life he wanted the world to see and the life he was actually living widened until it must have felt, to him, like standing over a split in the earth. Yet the terror of exposure did not make him seek tenderness, confession, or help. It drove him inward, deeper into the cold machinery of his own reasoning. He was a man who seemed to prefer order to intimacy, principle to mercy, judgment to vulnerability. Such people often sound calm right up until the moment they destroy everything near them. The family around him lived in the reach of that gathering storm without, perhaps, fully understanding the shape of it. His wife, Helen, occupied a difficult position inside the household, moving through rooms already thick with financial strain and emotional distance. Marriage in such a home can become a long negotiation with silence. Words are chosen carefully. Disappointments are swallowed, then stored. Familiarity does not soften tension. It teaches everyone how to step around it. The children were at ages when life stretches ahead in unfinished sketches. They had schools, interests, moods, private embarrassments. Small hopes that would have seemed trivial to adults, but were, to them, the center of lived experience. One imagines the sounds of that house before its silence became infamous. Footsteps on stairs, the muffled closing of bedroom doors. A radio somewhere in the afternoon, pages turning. Dishes meeting porcelain, the brief rise of laughter that comes unexpectedly and disappears almost at once in homes where laughter is not fully trusted. John List's mother was there too, another presence folded into the daily architecture of obligation. In many family homes, old age brings softness, a slowing that compels patience from others. In darker households, it becomes one more pressure, one more reflection of decline. One more reminder that life moves toward frailty, no matter how severely one arranges the furniture. These are the human details that give such crimes their lasting ache. The victims were not symbols waiting to be entered into a case file. They were people inhabiting their own hours, carrying ordinary concerns through ordinary days, while the person closest to the center of the home was silently converting those days into something final. What makes the List case linger in public memory is not only the scale of the betrayal, but the discipline with which it unfolded. There is something uniquely chilling about violence that does not erupt, but proceeds. A crime of frenzy allows the mind a terrible refuge. Rage, madness, loss of control. But when destruction is prepared, timed, imagined in advance, it forces a more disturbing question. What happens inside a person when conscience is not absent, but subordinated? When moral language itself becomes a tool for self-authorization, when prayer and murder begin to occupy the same internal chamber, without setting the soul on fire with contradiction. In the years that followed, John List would offer religious explanations, speaking in the careful tones of a man who had spent too long defending himself before an invisible tribunal. He suggested that he believed he was preserving his family from worse corruption, from a world he judged spiritually perilous, from a future in which they might drift away from salvation. Even hearing such reasoning secondhand, one can feel its frost. It is not faith. It is ownership disguised as righteousness. It is the voice of someone who cannot bear uncertainty and so imagines himself entitled to decide not only how others should live, but whether they should continue living at all. Yet those later rationalizations, however grotesque, did not appear out of empty air. They were prepared by years of inner habits, rigid thinking, moral absolutism, humiliation transmuted into judgment, and a belief that his role as patriarch gave him a terrifying claim over the destiny of those under his roof. The opening of this story, then, is not simply about a house in New Jersey or a man under financial strain. It is about the fatal meeting point of pride, control, despair, and belief distorted until it loses every trace of compassion. It is about the way certain tragedies begin long before the act itself, in the invisible discipline of thought. The world in 1971 still allowed a man like John List to move through it under the shelter of assumption. Respectability was a kind of armor. A church-going father, a man with formal manners, a household that looked proper from the street. These things could discourage deeper scrutiny. In suburban America, especially in communities that prized composure, ruin was often expected to remain private until it could no longer be hidden. Shame performed much of the work that locks and alarms perform elsewhere. Families learned how to keep appearances alive, even as their foundations weakened. The pressure to seem intact could become its own form of violence. Slow and suffocating. List lived inside that culture and amplified its harshest tendencies through his own temperament. To fail publicly was, for him, not just embarrassing, it was annihilating. Better, perhaps. In the courtroom, he built inside his own mind, to erase the witnesses than to endure the collapse of the role. That is what gives the story its dreadful gravity. He did not simply hate. He concluded, he did not simply panic. He organized. He turned his household into the object of a private verdict and moved toward it with the patience of a man balancing a ledger. The result would stay in American true crime history, not because it was the bloodiest case of its era, but because it was so methodical, so intimate, and so wrapped in the language of order. A family annihilator does more than kill. He rewrites the meaning of home. After such a crime, every domestic object seems altered. A kitchen table is no longer a place for homework and coffee, but a witness. A hallway is no longer transitional space, but a corridor through dread. Curtains, carpets, framed diplomas, hymnals, school books, all the unremarkable artifacts of shared life become evidence that ordinary domesticity can sit just inches from catastrophe without changing its expression. In the List case, that transformation was especially haunting because the man responsible did not immediately vanish into a blaze of suspicion. He disappeared into the country itself, into the vast American possibility of reinvention, carrying a new name like a well-packed suitcase. For years, he lived beneath the radar of public memory, proof that a person can do something monstrous and still step into grocery stores, neighborhoods, and church communities unnoticed if he understands how to wear normalcy correctly. That long disappearance cast a shadow backward over the beginning of the story. It suggests that concealment was not an improvisation born after the crime, but a skill already embedded in his character. The man who could live under another identity had likely been living under one all along. The dutiful father, the grave believer, the disciplined provider. These may not have been lies in the simple sense. They were partial truths, arranged so carefully that the deeper truth could survive beneath them without detection. And beneath them was a terrible vacancy where empathy should have stood guard. As this story opens, then, we are not yet in the moment of gunfire or the horror of discovery. We are in the colder place before that, where the future has already been poisoned by a decision known only to one person. The sky over New Jersey would have looked ordinary enough on those days. The roads carrying commuters, children, delivery trucks, Sunday habits. All the machinery of everyday life moving forward without hesitation. Somewhere nearby, dogs barked at nothing. Newspapers landed on porches. Stores turned signs from closed to open. The list house remained still, its facade preserving the illusion that whatever dramas unfolded inside it were survivable, temporary, private. That is often how evil prefers to begin. Not with spectacle, but with concealment. Not in a ruined place, but in a respectable one. The contrast is what makes the memory hard to shake. A mansion in a quiet town. A father in a suit. Children with futures. A family name that, until then, belonged only to itself. And inside that arrangement, a mind narrowing toward an act so absolute it would leave no room for apology. Only explanation after the fact. And even those explanations would feel less like remorse than paperwork filed too late. The first chapter of the list case belongs, therefore, to dread in its purest form. Not the dread of what the family knew, but the dread of what they did not. Somewhere between routine and catastrophe, between grace said over meals and the silent arithmetic of despair. Between the polished image of a proper household and the private collapse of the man at its head. The ending had already taken root. No one outside the home could yet see it. Perhaps even inside the home it looked, at first, like nothing more than another hard season. Another spell of tension. Another month in which bills had to wait and voices stayed low. But under that surface, something final was being prepared. And because the hand preparing it belonged to the person society had taught everyone to trust most, the shock would echo far beyond Westfield. It would linger for decades, not only because of what John List did, but because of what he represented. The terrifying possibility that devastation can grow in a man who appears composed, principled, and ordinary, until the day he decides that the lives around him are his to end. Westfield, New Jersey, in the early 1970s, was the sort of place that seemed to exist in deliberate opposition to chaos. Its streets were neat without feeling new, shaded by trees old enough to make every season look ceremonial. In autumn, leaves gathered along curbs in copper and russet drifts, and the light came down through bare branches and thin, pale sheets that made even ordinary houses look composed, almost self-conscious, as if the town knew it was being washed and intended to remain dignified under scrutiny. There were church bells, school schedules, commuter routines, grocery lists written in kitchens with polished counters, and neighbors who recognized one another's cars before they could make out a face behind the windshield. The air carried different messages depending on the hour. In the morning, it smelled of damp grass, cold pavement, coffee, and the faint exhaust of cars leaving for the city. In the evening, it settled into chimney smoke and the soft domestic sounds of doors closing, dishes being stacked, televisions glowing behind curtains. It was a town shaped by habit, by the confidence that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough for people to plan around it. That sort of environment can make danger harder to perceive. When people begin to mistake order for safety, they assume evil will look disruptive before it becomes destructive. They expect warning signs to be loud, but some lives unravel most efficiently in places where silence is valued. Where men learn early that collapse should be concealed until it can be managed. Or, if it cannot be managed, denied. Westfield provided the stage for the List family, not because it was sinister, but because it was so convincingly normal. That normalcy deepened the horror that would later attach itself to the address. The but it offered the perfect backdrop for a man who depended on respectability the way some men depend on oxygen. John List's world was built on structures that looked solid from a distance. Marriage, father. Religion, class position. Routine, person. All of it formed the shell of a life that, to an outsider, would have seemed stern, perhaps, but stable. Yet some structures are held together not by warmth or mutual trust, but by tension. They remain standing because everyone inside them has learned how much weight a single, honest conversation might bring crashing down in such households. Politeness is not evidence of peace. It is often the tool used to postpone it. The List home, grand in scale and old in its bearing, stood less like a refuge than like a monument to an idea of family that John List could not afford to lose. The house itself mattered. It was not merely where the family lived. It was a visible declaration of status, discipline, inheritance, and standing. The kind of property that silently told the town what kind of people belonged inside. Large homes exert pressure. Their elegance can become accusatory when the money thins out. Each room asks whether the life supporting it is real. Each polished surface reflects more than faces. It reflects pretense, aspiration, and, in moments of financial ruin, humiliation. It is difficult to overstate what shame can do inside a man who worships order more than truth. A practical person under severe money strain might reduce expenses, confess the situation, sell what cannot be sustained, begin again somewhere smaller and humbler. But humility requires a certain flexibility of self. It asks a person to survive being seen differently. John List does not appear to have possessed that flexibility. To him, the falling away of status was not just uncomfortable, it threatened the entire moral architecture through which he understood his place in the world. He had been raised in an era that tied manhood tightly to provision, seriousness, and external competence. A husband and father was supposed to lead, protect, and supply. To fail in those duties was not simply unfortunate, it could feel, especially to a rigid and deeply prideful mind, like a kind of spiritual rot. He was not a flamboyant man undone by extravagance. He was more dangerous than that, a controlled man undone by inadequacy. The external details of his life made him easy to underestimate. He was not the sort of figure who entered a room and commanded it. He did not blaze with charm or invite intimacy. He seemed instead like one of those men whose emotional life has been folded so flat it becomes almost invisible. He was educated, restrained, and dutiful in the surface sense. He understood institutions and moved within them respectfully. He presented himself through discipline rather than warmth. That often wins trust, especially in communities that value seriousness. A jovial man may be liked, but a grave man is often believed. Yet gravity can conceal many things. In John List, it seems to have concealed a habit of inner judgment so severe that he began to view the lives around him not as independent souls with their own fears and hopes, but as extensions of a collapsing order he alone was entitled to assess. He belonged to the species of patriarch for whom love easily curdles into stewardship, and stewardship into control. Such men do not always rage openly. Sometimes they simply grow colder and more absolute, until everyone else in the household is living under the climate they create. The List family inhabited that climate day by day. Helen List, his wife, lived at the center of a marriage that appears to have carried strain on multiple levels by the time the family's finances were deteriorating. The emotional ground beneath the marriage was already uneasy. One can imagine the rhythms of their interactions. the pauses before speaking, the calculations involved in raising practical concerns with a husband who measured the world through judgment and pressure. In many homes, hardship brings people closer. Not because it softens the facts, but because it forces honesty. In other homes, hardship exposes old fractures and makes intimacy feel dangerous. Money troubles, especially when hidden, seep into every corner of domestic life. They alter how people hear one another. A simple question becomes a challenge. A suggestion sounds like criticism. An expense becomes an accusation. The air inside the home changes long before anyone outside can name why. There may still be family dinners, school drop-offs, church attendance, ordinary conversations about weather or errands, but beneath them runs a subterranean current of dread. The children, too, would have felt it in whatever ways children feel what adults refuse to explain. They were not abstract victims waiting in the wings of a crime. They were young people moving through the unfinished work of becoming themselves. Their days had texture. There were classrooms, passing remarks from friends, sports or hobbies, private disappointments. The deep seriousness with which children and adolescents hold the immediate world. A poor grade can darken an afternoon. A compliment can brighten an entire week. A sibling's teasing can feel like betrayal by noon and be forgotten by supper. Their lives were still full of the small revolutions that mark ordinary youth. This is what family annihilation obliterates most cruelly. It does not only end lives. It cancels futures and their earliest drafts. It erases all the versions of adulthood those children might have grown into, all the unremarked milestones that never become visible because they are so brutally denied. And because the killer is not an outsider, but the father, the crime strikes at the deepest assumptions children are taught to inhabit. Home is supposed to be the place where the night is kept out. A parent is supposed to stand between danger and the child, not become danger in its most concentrated form. In the List household, there was also the presence of John List's mother, old enough that her life would have been shaped by memory, ritual, independence. Elderly parents living within adult children's households can deepen family bonds or strain them to breaking. Age alters the tempo of domestic life. It adds medication, appointments, fatigue, and the quiet grief of watching a once commanding generation bend under time. For some, this awakens tenderness. For others, especially those already saturated with resentment and pressure, it becomes one more symbol of burden and decay. In a rigid household, even need can be judged as failure. Even vulnerability can become an irritation. The presence of an aging mother in the home therefore belongs to the context not as background decoration, but as part of the tightening atmosphere. Another strand in the web of obligation John List appears to have experienced less as human connection than as accumulating weight. Religion played a central role in that atmosphere as well, though not in the way faith is meant to console and enlarge the human heart. In the world John List inhabited, religious devotion provided language, discipline, and a framework of meaning. It could have offered confession, humility, surrender, and compassion. But faith, when filtered through fear and pride, can become a mirror that reflects only one's own authority. It can become a vocabulary for judgment rather than grace. The most disturbing element of the List case is not that religion was present, but that it seems to have been weaponized inwardly, transformed into a scaffold on which he could hang his own private verdicts. There is a vast difference between trusting God and appointing oneself the executor of God's imagined preferences. Yet for minds drawn to certainty, that distinction can erode. A man embarrassed by financial failure, frightened of social humiliation, and obsessed with moral order may begin to interpret his personal collapse as a cosmic drama. Once he does that, ordinary human solutions start to look like compromises, and compromise feels to him like sin. This is how fanaticism often enters not as spectacle, but as a narrowing of options. The sufferer decides that only the most absolute act remains faithful, honorable, or clean. Outside the house, America was in a period of tension and transition. The early 1970s carried cultural anxieties that touched even tidy suburbs, though their effects arrived filtered through newspapers, television screens, church conversations, and traditional structures still held great power, but they no longer seemed unquestionable. Generational differences were widening. Ideas, family, duty, and more for a man as rigid as John List. Such a landscape may have intensified his fear if he already believed the world beyond his household to be morally unstable, that his private failures would not have felt merely economic. They would have felt like surrender to disorder. Men like him often imagine themselves as the last barrier against decline, and that self-image can become lethal once reality begins proving them powerless. There is something especially chilling about a personality that responds to helplessness by seeking total power over whatever remains within reach. That is one reason family annihilators are so difficult to understand through ordinary emotional logic. Their crimes are not acts of love in any meaningful sense, no matter how they later phrase them. They are acts of possession. They reveal a mind that cannot tolerate the independence of others, especially when its own self-concept is collapsing. If he cannot be the successful father, the respectable provider, the guiding patriarch, then no one under his authority will continue on into a future that exposes his failure. This is not despair in the humble, broken sense. It is despair infected by ego, sharpened into entitlement. The family home became the physical chamber in which all these tensions condensed. One can imagine the rooms holding layers of contradictory feeling. There may have been holiday decorations packed away in closets, reminders of better seasons, or at least better performances of family life. There were likely school items left on chairs, shoes near doorways, laundry folded and unfolded, bills hidden in drawers, perhaps unopened envelopes whose weight could be felt before the paper was touched. Domestic life leaves traces everywhere. A hairbrush with strands still caught in it, a coat slung over a banister, a textbook open to a page never finished. These small objects make the context almost unbearable because they prove how recently ordinary life was still in motion. Tragedy is always more devastating when it interrupts the unfinished. A perfectly set stage is eerie. A lived-in room is heartbreaking. The List house, with its grandeur and its silence, would later seem almost gothic in retrospect. But before the crime, it was simply inhabited. That fact matters. Evil did not descend onto an empty monument. It grew in a lived space, among routines, in the middle of ongoing conversations and deferred worries. John List's internal world during this period can only be reconstructed indirectly, but the outlines are grimly suggestive. Financial collapse alone does not produce this crime. Countless families endure ruin, shame, job loss, debt, and humiliation without violence. What transforms hardship into annihilation is character. It is the shape of the mind enduring the hardship. In his case, the available portrait suggests a man who combined emotional distance, rigid morality, self-importance, and a severe need for control. Such a mind does not adapt easily. It does not bend, grieve aloud, or allow others to help. Instead, it calculates, it withdraws, It begins to see other people less as companions in suffering than as variables in a problem requiring a decisive solution. This is the true context of the List murders. Not only a town, not only a decade, not only money trouble, not only religion, but the slow hardening of one man's inner life until every ordinary pressure became part of a logic that excluded mercy. By the time the crime approached, the visible world may still have appeared almost unchanged. The town remained neat. The seasons continued their work. Churches filled on Sundays. Children rode to school. Neighbors performed the ceremonies of suburban courtesy. Yet inside one respected home, the meaning of fatherhood had already begun to curdle into something monstrous. That is why the case has endured so powerfully in the American imagination. It was not only a murder case. It was an assault on the mythology of domestic safety, on the belief that evil announces itself clearly and comes from elsewhere. In Westfield, it came from within the family. From within the structure meant to shelter it, and from within the man most empowered to define the household's moral terms. The context, then, is not merely scenery before the act. It is the tightening wire itself. A respectable town, a proud and rigid man. A family enclosed by financial decline, a large house turning from symbol into burden. A faith emptied of tenderness and refilled with judgment, and a silence so complete that when the catastrophe finally came, it would seem to many not only horrifying, but impossible. Yet impossibility is often only what people call a truth they failed to see forming. Before a family becomes the subject of headlines, court records, and documentaries, it exists in a far more fragile and meaningful form. It exists in routines so ordinary they rarely seem worth describing at the time. A mother moving from room to room with the small invisible labor that keeps a household from collapsing into disorder. Children carrying books, opinions, anxieties, and private dreams from one day into the next. An older woman moving more slowly than the rest, bound to memory, habit, and the narrowing territory of age. Their lives are not arranged in neat moral lessons while they are being lived. They are textured, inconsistent, filled with unfinished thoughts and ordinary concerns. That is why the victim side of a case like this must be told carefully. To reduce them to names in a sequence of deaths is to allow the killer's action to become the dominant fact of their existence. But before John List decided to end the lives around him, the people inside that house were still living forward. They were not symbols of his despair. They were separate human beings, each carrying a different version of what the home meant, each vulnerable in a different way to the atmosphere he created. Helen List stood at the emotional center of that world in the complicated, exhausting way many wives and mothers do. Her role would not have been ceremonial. It would have been constant. The keeping of appointments, the remembering of details, the management of moods, the maintenance of appearances, the work of noticing what others overlook. In a large home under financial strain, every domestic task acquires an added edge. Things must still appear orderly, even when the foundations are trembling. Meals still need to be prepared. Clothing still needs to be washed, folded, put away. Children still need to be sent into the world each morning looking cared for, even if the adults in the home are emotionally fraying. A woman in that position often becomes both witness and buffer. She sees the decline more clearly than others do because she lives among its daily evidence. She knows which bills have been delayed, which repairs have not been made, which explanations no longer hold together. She hears the tension in a husband's footsteps before he enters the room. She learns when to speak, when to delay, when to redirect a conversation before it becomes dangerous in the emotional sense, and sometimes in darker cases, dangerous in ways no one is ready to admit. Helen's life, viewed from the outside, may have looked respectable and stable. But respectability can be one of the loneliest disguises a family wears. It asks a person to keep performing composure even when composure has become a burden. One can imagine her moving through the mansion's rooms with a growing sense that the house itself had become too large for what was left of the family's true security. Large homes often magnify tension because they require effort to maintain the illusion they represent. Every hallway echoes. Every closed door feels intentional. Every room left empty seems to accuse the people still occupying the rest. If she sensed that the family's circumstances were shrinking while the house remained an oversized shell around them, she would also have sensed the danger of naming that truth directly to a man like John List. Men who build their identity on competence often hear practical concern as humiliation. In such marriages, honesty does not always produce relief. Sometimes it produces icy resistance, moralizing lectures, or long silences that settle over the house like weather no one can change. Yet within that pressure, Helen would still have been a mother, and motherhood imposes its own fierce continuity. However strained the marriage, however uncertain the finances, the children's lives continued to call her attention outward. Their schedules, their needs, their arguments, their illnesses, their emotions. A mother in crisis rarely gets the luxury of collapsing completely. She must keep moving. Keep smoothing. Keep improvising normalcy for the sake of those younger lives still forming in her care. Strength in such settings is often purchased through silence. The children inhabited the same house, but not the same reality. Childhood and adolescence create separate kingdoms within one home. A child may notice tone without understanding motive, may feel fear without naming it, may learn to read the atmosphere by sound alone. The click, the tempo of footsteps, the length of a pause before an answer. These become signals. Older children and teenagers, meanwhile, live at the threshold between dependence and selfhood. Yet they are also consumed by their own emerging identities. School, friends, embarrassment, ambition, rebellion, loneliness. All of it presses forward at once. This is what makes their loss so especially devastating. Their futures were already branching. There were versions of themselves just beginning to take shape. Perhaps there were subjects they liked more than others, teachers they admired or resented, private rituals before school, favorite snacks, resentments that would have seemed huge that week and trivial a month later. Perhaps one child was quieter, learning to retreat into inward space when tension rose in the house. Perhaps another was more expressive, more visibly affected by conflict, more likely to test the emotional limits of the adults around them. Siblings do not suffer the same household in the same way. Each develops a method for surviving it. One becomes compliant, one becomes watchful. One tries to make peace, one escapes mentally into books, music, sports, plans for the future, whatever forms those adaptations took. The crucial truth remains the same. Their lives belonged to them. Their father's later explanations could never erase the independent reality of their inner worlds. They were not passengers on his spiritual crisis. They were children and young people still becoming, still learning what safety meant, still trusting to one degree or another that home was where the day eventually came to rest. In a house under strain, even ordinary family rituals can take on added emotional importance. A shared meal may feel less like simple nourishment and more like a test of whether the household still holds together. A drive to school can become one of the few moments when a child feels the world widen beyond the pressure at home. An afternoon spent in a bedroom, with books open and music low, and the light changing through the window, can become a form of private refuge. These are not sentimental details. They are the real substance of a victim's life. They remind us that what was destroyed was not abstract innocence, but lived time. It is likely that each member of the List family had developed unspoken habits around John List's temperament. Families organized around a rigid father often become highly skilled at anticipation. They know which topics create tension. They know how to read his mood from the set of his face or the silence after a question. They know when to be scarce, when to be agreeable, when to let him speak without challenge, when to avoid drawing attention to a problem that cannot be solved in the moment. This kind of adaptation is rarely visible to outsiders because it looks, from a distance, like discipline or respect. But from the inside, it often feels like caution. The victims in such cases are not only killed by the final act, they are also shaped for years by the emotional gravity of the person who eventually destroys them. Even before physical violence enters the story, the atmosphere of control has already narrowed their lives. John List's mother, living under the same roof, would have occupied yet another dimension of that private world. Old age changes not only the body, but the relationship between time and identity. The elderly live increasingly among memory, among losses already absorbed, among routines that steady a day whose horizons have become smaller. To depend on family in that stage of life is both ordinary and vulnerable. Dependence can expose a person to tenderness, but in the wrong household, it can also expose them to impatience, resentment, and quiet devaluation. An aging mother in such a home might have clung to familiar rituals as a way of preserving dignity. Certain meals at certain times, certain objects kept in precise places, the repetition of stories already told. The desire for continuity, even as the household around her grew unstable. Her presence in the victim's story is especially haunting because the elderly are so often treated in criminal narratives as peripheral, when in truth, they are repositories of family history. She would have known John List not as the public monster he became, but as a son once held in her arms, once corrected, once worried over, once watched as he grew into the severe, brittle man he later became. There is a particular tragedy in crimes that move across generations under one roof, because they reveal how family can become not a line of care, but a corridor of destruction. The victim's perspective in a case like this also includes what was never fully said. Families under strain accumulate unfinished conversations. Helen may have had fears she could not articulate completely, even to herself, because to articulate them would have made them real. The children may have carried questions about their father's moods, the family's money, the future of the household, without knowing whether those questions were allowed. The grandmother may have sensed decline without possessing the strength or power to alter it. These silent perceptions matter. Human beings often understand more than they can admit, especially when the truth threatens the structure in which they must keep living. A child may know that something is wrong, but choose not to examine it directly because home must remain livable. A spouse may see the marriage hardening into something joyless and dangerous in spirit, yet continue managing day by day because children still need breakfast and shoes and help with homework. The victim's story is therefore not a clean narrative leading toward inevitable doom. It is a field of partial awareness, denial, endurance, duty, and hope. Even in troubled homes, people go on hoping in small ways. They hope tomorrow's mood will be better. They hope a practical solution will appear. They hope the children are less affected than they seem. They hope the season will change something, that work will improve, that church will comfort. That routine itself will carry the family across a hard stretch. Hope in such settings is often not grand. It is granular. It lives in the next day rather than the next decade. That is precisely what makes the coming violence so cruel. It interrupts people not at the point of dramatic understanding, but in the middle of their ordinary acts of continuation. To tell the victim's story honestly also means recognizing the emotional labor involved in loving a difficult man. Families do not always stay around rigid or controlling people because they are blind to the problem. Often they stay because family bonds are made of history, duty, religion, dependence, social expectation, financial constraint, and the persistent human impulse to believe that difficult things can still be managed. Helen's life with John List would have included not only strain, but likely memories of earlier hopes, earlier versions of him, earlier reasons the marriage was entered in the first place. The children, too, would not have seen him in only one dimension. A frightening or cold father is still a father. He may also have moments of approval, order, routine, even apparent stability that complicate the emotional picture. Victims in family annihilation cases are not standing outside the danger, clearly identifying it as outsiders might. They are inside a web of relationship, trying to live within it. That is why blame must never drift toward them through hindsight. They were not responsible for correctly diagnosing the darkness in the man closest to them. They were busy living. The deepest grief in the List case lies partly in this fact. Those who died were engaged in the ordinary, unheroic, deeply human work of continuing family life under strain. They were enduring, adapting, hoping, waiting, and carrying forward the habits of a household that still, for all its tension, presented itself as a home. Their lives contained meals unfinished, school years incomplete, aging not yet complete, conversations deferred until later, errands still to run, emotional repairs that may or may not ever have happened. None of them woke inside a drama they fully understood. They woke inside their lives, and those lives, though overshadowed by John List's later notoriety, deserve to be remembered in their own right. Helen with the exhausted resilience of a woman holding too many threads at once, the children with their unfinished selves pressing toward adulthood, the elderly mother with the slow dignity and vulnerability of age, the victim's statement, if it can be imagined at all in a story where they were denied their own final words, is not a single declaration. It is the sum of their ordinary existence. It is the sound of movement in the house before silence took over. It is the evidence that they were there as people and not just casualties. It is the reminder that inside the imposing New Jersey home, there was not a tableau awaiting tragedy, but a family still caught in the rhythms of daily life, still carrying private thoughts no one else could fully hear, still assuming in one way or another that tomorrow belonged to them. That assumption, so basic and so innocent, is what the killer stole first, long before he stole breath. He stole the future from the people who had entrusted their present, however imperfectly, to the same roof under which he had been given the role of protector, and because they were his wife, his children, his mother. Their story must never be told as a footnote to his psychology alone. It begins with them alive, separate, vulnerable, and real, moving through the last ordinary stretch of their lives, without knowing that the man sharing their name had already begun to think of them not as loved ones, but as lives he believed he had the right to end. The day itself did not arrive with the kind of atmosphere people later wish it had. There was no sky split open by thunder. No unnatural hush over the neighborhood. No visible sign that the house standing in quiet New Jersey dignity had become, by then, the setting for a decision already made in one man's mind. That is part of what makes crimes like this feel so permanently unsettling. The world outside continues in its ordinary rhythm, indifferent and unchanged, while inside a private home, the meaning of everything is being rewritten. Morning comes. Light moves across floors. Water runs through pipes. Somewhere beyond the property line, a car door shuts. A dog barks. A newspaper lands against a porch. The routines of civilization continue, as if routine itself were protection. But routine is only a pattern. And patterns do not defend anyone when the danger already lives inside the house and knows exactly how the day is arranged. By the time the murders began, John List was not improvising. He had crossed beyond hesitation into plan. And that difference is crucial. There is a terrible moral abyss between violence that explodes in sudden passion and violence that is prepared, scheduled, and internally justified before the first irreversible act occurs. What happened in the List home belongs to that second category. The incident was not only a series of killings, it was the execution of a private verdict, one that had apparently been forming under the surface of daily life long enough for him to begin treating the future as something already settled. That is why the incident must be understood not as a moment of emotional collapse, but as the outward completion of a colder process. The emotional collapse had happened earlier, silently, in thought. What remains now was action. To imagine the opening of that day is to imagine a house still carrying the traces of family life. Bedrooms containing clothes, books, school materials, personal objects left where they had been used. A kitchen bearing the recent habits of meals and routines. Hallways still holding the echo of those who moved through them every day without suspecting that the household had already, in one mind, at least, been condemned. A family home is full of evidence that life assumes its own continuation. That assumption is visible everywhere. There are things left out because someone expects to return to them. There are tasks not yet finished because time seems plentiful enough to finish them later. There are ordinary domestic postponements that only become heartbreaking after the fact. The cruelty of the incident lies partly in that contrast. Those inside the house were still moving through hours that belonged, in their understanding, to the normal obligations of living. John List, meanwhile, had entered a state in which those same hours were no longer shared time, but controlled sequence. He seems to have seen the day less as something being lived with his family than as something being managed over them. There is something especially chilling about that transformation. It marks the moment when intimacy has been fully replaced by dominion. A wife is no longer seen as a person with her own mind, dignity, and future, but as someone included within a decision made elsewhere. Children are no longer encountered as vulnerable lives requiring protection, but as dependents whose existence can be terminated under the authority of the father. An elderly mother becomes not a human being bound to him by history and care, but another element in a plan. When that moral inversion is complete, the acts that follow may still appear outwardly calm. Calm is not innocence. In some crimes, calm is the final luxury of the person who has already silenced conscience enough to proceed. The incident in the List case unfolded within that calm, which is one reason it has retained such power in the public imagination. We are disturbed not only by bloodshed, but by composure in the service of bloodshed. One can imagine John List moving through the house with the inward stillness of a man who has mistaken certainty for righteousness. It is possible that he prayed. It is possible that he experienced the day not as murder in the language most people would use, but as a terrible duty interpreted through the warped religious logic he later offered. That does not mitigate the crime. It deepens its horror. To cloak violence in the garments of moral conviction is to attempt to make cruelty sacred, and the more disciplined the killer appears, the more clearly one sees that what has failed is not impulse control, but the entire moral framework through which he has granted himself permission to proceed. The wife who shared his home, the children who relied on him, the mother who had once cared for him when he was helpless. All were placed beneath a judgment none of them had participated in. None of them had any chance to contest. And none of them likely saw approaching in its full form until it was too late. The day, therefore, becomes not only a chronology of action, but an anatomy of betrayal. Every domestic familiarity inside the house would have worked in his favor. He knew where people would be, how the day moved, how trust functioned within the household. Family life creates predictability, and in healthy homes, that predictability is a comfort. In murderous hands, it becomes opportunity. The routines that should have made the family safe made them accessible instead. That is one of the most unbearable truths at the core of family annihilation. The very intimacy that ought to protect becomes the mechanism through which violence is delivered with maximum control. The victims are not taken by surprise because they ignored danger from outside. They're taken by surprise because they're inside the ordinary trust structures of home, and home has suddenly changed its meaning without their knowledge. The incident moved through generations under one roof. That fact alone gives it a particular bleakness. It was not the destruction of a single relationship breaking under strain. It was the collapse of the family line inside the family home, carried out by the person occupying its center of power: wife, children, mother. The arrangement itself matters. It reveals the scope of the annihilating impulse. John List was not striking at one person he blamed. He was erasing the immediate human circle around him. The domestic universe in which his failure as provider, patriarch, and moral authority had become unbearable to him. That is why the killings cannot be separated from the psychology of possession. He was not escaping his family. He was deciding that if he could not sustain the life they represented, they would not continue without him. This is not the logic of sacrifice. It is the logic of ownership carried to its most monstrous end, the home. During those hours, would have become something almost unrecognizable in spiritual terms, even while the furniture remained still. The walls stood upright, and the rooms retained their familiar appearance. There is something uniquely disturbing about indoor crimes of this kind, because domestic space is designed for repetition, comfort, and memory. Hallways connect known rooms. Staircases lead to beds, closets, children's belongings, family photographs, the residue of shared years. To commit murder in such a setting is to turn accumulated intimacy into a weapon against itself. Every room becomes divided between what it had been and what it now holds. One cannot think of such an incident without imagining the afterimage of normal life still clinging to the scene. A coat hanging where it had been left, a school item not yet put away, a chair slightly moved from its place, evidence that the day had expected to continue. Even without dwelling on the physical details of the killings themselves, the emotional violence of that interruption is immense. It is the obliteration of continuity. It is the forced end of unfinished days. And at the center of it stood a man acting not as though he had lost control, but as though control had reached its purest form. That is perhaps the most frightening aspect of the incident in many notorious crimes. The public looks for madness, because madness creates distance. If the killer was visibly incoherent, then ordinary families can reassure themselves that the danger would have looked different from everything familiar. But List did not offer that easy separation. He appears instead as a man who had become terrifyingly coherent within his own distorted worldview. He could plan, sequence, conceal, and move forward. He could function. That functionality is the point of terror. It suggests that the human mind can be both organized and morally catastrophic at once. That a person can remain externally composed while internally crossing every line that makes civilization possible. The incident also contains, in its aftermath, within the same day, the first gestures of concealment. Murder alone was not enough. The scene had to be managed. Appearances, even then, still mattered. This tells us something profound about the continuity between the life John List had lived before the killings and the actions he took after them. The same obsession with control, presentation, and order that had shaped his public identity did not dissolve once the murders were complete. It continued. The household had to be arranged into silence. The world outside had to be delayed in its understanding. He did not suddenly become a different kind of person after the act. He remained the same kind of person, only fully revealed, even in the shadow of unspeakable betrayal. He seems to have retained the bureaucratic instincts of a man managing outcomes. That moral coldness is often more haunting than frenzy. It means the humanity of the victims had already been subordinated so completely that even after their deaths, they were still being handled as part of his plan. A family annihilator does not only end lives. He attempts to dictate how the world will encounter those ended lives. When their absence will be noticed, how long his own freedom will last. What story will temporarily replace the truth? The house, during those post-incident hours, must have felt suspended between two incompatible realities. To the outside world, it still belonged to the realm of the living family. To the man inside it, it had already become something else. A completed site, a closed chapter. A domestic structure emptied of its future, but still useful for staging delay. This split between appearance and reality had defined the family's life for some time. But after the incident, it became absolute. That is one reason the List case endures. It is not just a story about murder. It is a story about the terrifying length of time reality can remain hidden when concealed by the rituals of normalcy. Curtains still hang. Cars may still sit where neighbors expect to see them. Mail still arrives. A respectable address continues existing on the street map. Meanwhile, the truth has already become irreparable. In narrative terms, Part 4 is where the private tensions of the earlier sections stop being atmospheric and become irreversible. But it is important not to flatten that shift into a simple action scene. The incident is tragic precisely because it is the collision point between ordinary life and final violence. It is where breakfasts, school schedules, domestic concerns, old grievances, financial dread, religious distortion, and patriarchal control all narrow into a single day from which no one in the family, except the killer, emerges. The emotional weight lies not only in what he did, but in the fact that he did it within the daily world his victims had trusted enough to inhabit without fear. Every true crime case involving the family contains a second, quieter wound. The theft of trust from everyone who comes after. Once people learn such a story, the idea of home changes slightly. The father at the dinner table is no longer automatically reassuring. The respectable house on a quiet street is no longer proof of safety. The language of duty and religion no longer sounds innocent when spoken by a man who cannot tolerate weakness. The incident in the List case has that lasting cultural force because it punctured more than one household. It punctured a national fantasy that order, religion, and domestic structure naturally restrain darkness. In reality, they can conceal it beautifully when the person at the center knows how to wear them. The New Jersey setting matters here, not only because it was the physical location, but because it represented a certain American promise. Stability, family, continuity, upward respectability. The incident violated all of that from within, and in doing so, revealed how fragile those promises become when one person is allowed to define morality as obedience to his own fear. What happened in that house was not the sudden arrival of evil in an otherwise transparent life. It was the completion of a long inward process that no one outside had fully seen, and that those inside could not have been expected to diagnose in time. The day's horror belongs, therefore, to both action and blindness, his deliberate movement through the plan, and their final unawareness that the person nearest to them had already stepped beyond the boundaries of human care by the time the incident ended. The List home had been transformed from a strained family residence into a mausoleum of appearances, and John List had crossed the line that divides private despair from historical infamy. Yet even then, one senses that he did not experience himself as infamy. He likely experienced himself as resolved. That is what makes him so chilling. He did not need the world's approval in that moment because he had already built a smaller, harsher court within himself and declared the verdict sufficient. The killings were the enactment of that verdict. The silence that followed was its immediate aftermath. And the emptiness left behind was not only the absence of 5 lives, but the destruction of every ordinary expectation those lives had carried into that day. In that sense, the incident did not merely happen inside the house. It devoured the meaning of the house itself. What had once been a family home became, in a matter of hours, a monument to the most intimate form of betrayal. The moment when a father ceased to see those closest to him as human beings and treated their existence as a problem he alone had the right to solve. By the time a crime scene is finally discovered, the violence itself is over, but another kind of darkness begins. It is the darkness of reconstruction, of rooms that can no longer speak except through the objects left in them. The positions of things, the silence that has settled unnaturally over a place once shaped by daily movement. In the List case, the house did not immediately surrender its secret. That delay is part of what made the discovery so haunting. The murders were not exposed by an instant alarm or a dramatic interruption. Instead, the family home remained standing in its ordinary grandeur while absence slowly thickened around it. The neighborhood continued living beside it. Days passed. Mail accumulated. Routine outside the property line continued with the same calm confidence as before. Somewhere nearby, cars came and went. Lawns were crossed. Doors were locked at night. Televisions flickered behind curtains, and ordinary people assumed that whatever silence belonged to the List house was still part of the private weather of family life. But silence changes character when it lasts too long. A home can be quiet in 100 harmless ways. Yet, after enough time, quiet begins to resemble erasure. There is something especially eerie about a house that looks preserved rather than abandoned, because preservation suggests intention. It suggests that someone has taken care to hold appearances in place just long enough for reality to hide behind them. That is what the List home became in the period before discovery. A carefully hushed container of the unspeakable when people finally entered and the truth emerged. The first shock would not have been movement or chaos, but stillness. Crime scenes involving sudden public violence often bear the marks of disorder immediately. A family annihilation inside a private home can feel different. The setting remains domestic. Furniture is where it belongs. Pictures still hang straight on the walls. Everyday objects continue radiating the assumption of family life. That contrast is what unsettles the human mind so deeply. The scene does not announce horror through ruin alone. It announces horror through the coexistence of normal surroundings and irrevocable absence. Here is a table at which people once ate. Here is a hallway people once crossed without fear. Here is a staircase leading upward into bedrooms where tomorrow had been expected. And here, within that ordinary architecture, lies the evidence that home has been converted into something its walls were never meant to hold. The discovery in such a setting carries a specific emotional force because those who arrive are not merely seeing the aftermath of death. They are seeing trust broken at the level of structure. The house itself has become a lie. Every object now points backward toward a life that was interrupted without warning. Every room has to be looked at twice. Once for what it had been in ordinary time, and again for what it has become in forensic time. That shift from domestic meaning to evidentiary meaning is one of the most tragic dimensions of crime scene discovery. Bedrooms stop being places of sleep and privacy. They become sites of sequence, timing, and interpretation. Family possessions cease to be possessions and become clues. The dead are encountered first not through memory, but through arrangement. Even the air inside such a house seems altered. Heavy with closure, with the sensation that time itself stopped inside, while the rest of the town continued onward. In the List case, the initial clues were inseparable from the strange persistence of normal-looking conditions. The family had not been publicly accounted for. Their disappearance had not produced an immediate, fully understood emergency. Instead, there was delay, and delay always changes the nature of discovery. It allows the killer's intention to linger in the scene. It lets the house become a stage upon which absence matures into suspicion. Neighbors may notice curtains never changing, activity failing to resume, small patterns breaking down. Someone may ask a practical question and receive no answer. At first, these interruptions can be explained away. People travel. Families leave town. Illness happens. Privacy is respected. Suburban life is often built on the assumption that what happens inside a home belongs, until proven otherwise, to the family within it. That assumption protects dignity in ordinary times, in extraordinary times. It protects concealment when the house was finally entered with real concern. What waited inside was not merely death, but planning made visible. The scene would have communicated almost immediately that this was no accident, no intrusion from a passing predator, no random event of public violence. It carried the unmistakable signature of intimacy. In a family home, the distribution of bodies, the lack of external disorder in certain places, the continuity of the interior arrangement. All of this would have suggested that the killer knew the space and its inhabitants intimately. Crimes of this kind do not need a note to declare themselves personal. The house itself says so. The positions of ordinary belongings, the undisturbed familiarity of the rooms, the absence of the kinds of frantic disruption associated with outside invasion, all point inward, toward someone who belonged there and moved through it with confidence. That is the first and perhaps deepest clue in any family annihilation scene. Not a single object. But the terrible fact that the home has not been breached so much as betrayed. There is also the matter of emotional evidence, which never appears on official diagrams but always shapes the human experience of discovery. The List home would have carried layers of it. There were the signs of children's lives interrupted, which are often the most unbearable details for anyone walking through a murder scene. A child's belongings do not know that the child is gone. School materials remain where they were placed, with the expectation of later use. Clothing still suggests tomorrow's dressing. Personal items radiate the unfinished texture of ordinary youth. This kind of evidence does not help only in constructing chronology. It testifies to innocence. It insists that these were people in motion, not abstractions. The same is true of the adult spaces, a wife's objects, an elderly mother's routine possessions, the ordinary arrangement of domestic labor. All of it remains behind, like a language the dead can no longer speak. Investigators in such homes must look clinically at what is, in every human sense, heartbreaking. They must measure while feeling. They must separate sequence from grief, even as grief is built into the walls. The initial clues in the List case would therefore have included not only forensic realities, but the eerie impression of order maintained beyond life. This is what John List left behind. Not the chaos of emotional explosion, but the residue of a mind determined to stage delay. To hold the world off a little longer. To let the family home continue impersonating normalcy after normalcy had already been destroyed. That feature sets the case apart in public memory. The crime scene was not only a place where murders occurred, it was also a place where concealment had been woven into the aftermath. In many notorious cases, the scene screams. Here, the scene withheld, and that withholding became one of its loudest clues once people understood what they were looking at. The house itself had been turned into an accomplice of time. That reveals much about the killer's psychology. He was not done exerting control when the killings ended. He needed the truth to arrive on his own terms, or at least later than it otherwise would have. He wanted absence to remain unconfirmed long enough for him to move beyond immediate reach. In that sense, the crime scene contained evidence not only of what happened, but of what happened next in his mind. He was already thinking ahead to delay, to escape, to the management of appearances. The initial clues must therefore be read in two directions at once. They pointed backward toward the acts committed inside the home, and forward toward the fugitive logic already taking shape beyond it. One can imagine the emotional impact on the first people to fully comprehend the scene. Even trained responders are still human beings before they are technicians. To walk into a grand residence in a respectable town and realize that an entire family has been extinguished inside it is to feel the floor of ordinary social belief tilt beneath you. The size of the house, the social standing it implied, the domestic order still visible in it. All of that would have deepened the disbelief. There is a difference between encountering violence in a place already associated with danger and encountering it in a space designed to project dignity and family continuity. The latter forces the mind to reconcile incompatible truths. This was a home. This was a slaughter site. These people lived here. These people died here. The father belonged here. The father did this. Such realizations do not arrive all at once. They build, each clue narrowing the field of possible explanations until the unthinkable hardens into the only explanation left. The early clues also included something more intangible but no less important, the sense of time having been manipulated. A fresh crime scene and a delayed one tell different stories. Delay creates peculiar textures. It freezes certain moments while allowing others to decay. It introduces an uncanny relationship between recent life and discovered death. The mail piling up, the lack of response, the stale preservation of routine. These become part of the crime's atmosphere. They tell investigators that the family did not simply vanish from public view. They were hidden by the continuity of the home's outward face. This hiddenness made the eventual discovery feel less like uncovering a single act and more like stepping into a sealed chamber where one man's decision had been allowed to sit undisturbed in the dark. That dark matters. It is not only physical. It is moral. It represents the span of time in which the killer's will remained unchallenged. The period in which the victims were denied even the dignity of prompt witness. That, too, is part of the cruelty of the crime. The dead waited in silence while the man responsible began the next phase of his life. In forensic terms, A scene like this invites sequence. Who was where? When? And in what order? What path did the killer take? How was the house used after the murders? What signs reveal deliberation rather than impulse? But beneath all of that lies the emotional architecture of the place. And in the List case, the architecture itself carries symbolic weight. This was not a cramped apartment of desperation or a roadside site of sudden violence. It was a large, respectable family residence, a structure associated with continuity, aspiration, and establishment. The crime scene, therefore, spoke to a broader American unease. It suggested that prestige and domestic formality cannot protect a family from internal collapse. More disturbingly, they can disguise that collapse until it is nearly complete. The initial clues scattered through the house would have underscored that point again and again. The polished setting did not soften the horror, it sharpened it. The appearance of refinement became part of the contrast that made the deaths so memorable. Some crime scenes tell the story of a brutal world intruding on ordinary life. This one told the story of brutality rising from inside ordinary life itself, and then taking pains to make the ordinary facade persist just a little longer. That is why the discovery phase in the List case belongs not only to investigation, but to haunting. Once a family home is uncovered in this state, it changes forever. Not just for those connected to the case, but in the public imagination. The address ceases to be an address. It becomes a symbol, a container for dread, a reminder that evil can live for years beneath the manners and routines of middle-class domesticity. The first clues are therefore not merely technical entry points into solving a crime. They are the first fractures in the illusion that such a home was ever safe in the way it appeared. By the time investigators, officials, and later the public began trying to understand what had happened, the house had already told them the essential truth in its own mute language. This was not random. This was not outside. This was intimate, deliberate, patient, and cold. The rooms, the arrangements, the waiting silence, the delayed discovery. The ordinary artifacts of family life, interrupted but not erased. All of these pointed toward a killer who knew the habits of the home because he was one of the habits of the home. And that, finally, is the most devastating clue of all. The crime scene did not simply reveal death. It revealed that the source of death had shared meals there, walked those hallways, inhabited that structure under the title of father and son and husband. The discovery exposed not only a massacre, but a terrible inversion of family itself. What should have been the safest identity in the house had become the most lethal one. And the clues left behind in the stillness of the rooms were not only pieces of evidence, they were the shattered remains of trust. Laid out in a mansion that had once been mistaken for a fortress and was now understood, too late, as the stage for one of the most chilling betrayals in American criminal history, when investigators begin working a family massacre. Suspicion moves first through the house like a second wind. It touches every relationship, every recent argument, every financial problem, every absence that can be converted into motive. In the List case, the first true suspect did not emerge from the outside world at all. He existed as an absence inside the center of the crime. John List was not found among the dead, and that fact changed everything. In one sense, it simplified the direction of inquiry immediately. In another, it opened a vast and frustrating field of uncertainty. A missing father in a house where his wife, children, and mother had been killed is not simply a person to locate. He is the shape around which every theory begins to tighten. Yet, even when suspicion points inward, the path to certainty is rarely straight. Investigations in such cases do not proceed as clean moral stories. They proceed through paperwork, interviews, conjecture, false emphasis, emotional fatigue, and the slow grinding work of building structure from horror. The dead are silent. The living are partial, frightened, mistaken, or withholding. And the suspect, if he is disciplined enough, can turn time itself into his first and most effective accomplice. In the days after the List home gave up its terrible secret, the investigators would have found themselves confronting two crimes at once. The first was the massacre itself, intimate and devastating. The second was the disappearance, which transformed the father from presumed victim or witness into the gravitational center of the case. A man does not vanish cleanly from a family annihilation without pulling enormous suspicion onto himself. But suspicion is not the same as apprehension. The world beyond the house remained open. Roads extended in every direction. State lines meant little to a man willing to abandon his past. Paper identities in that era could still be assembled with less friction than people today might imagine. A person who understood how to look ordinary could enter the vast anonymity of American life and be received, if not warmly, then at least without resistance. That possibility hung over the investigation from the beginning like a taunt. The killer was not merely unknown in abstract terms. He was likely out there breathing, traveling, adapting, perhaps. But before that possibility hardened into the case's most maddening reality, investigators had to move through the disciplined process of examining everyone and everything around the family. This is where Part 6 truly lives, in the widening circle of suspicion. The inevitable narrowing toward John List, and then the long dead end created by his ability to disappear into the country's ordinary surfaces. At first, every family relationship becomes investigable. Helen's life, her friendships, her private tensions, her possible conflicts, her habits, all would have been examined. Investigators must ask painful questions, not because they disrespect the dead, but because murder rearranges intimacy into potential evidence. Had there been affairs, feuds, threats, humiliations, neighbors who had noticed something, relatives who had recently argued with the family, debts owed, resentments brewing, strangers seen near the property, patterns of tension that in ordinary life might have passed as domestic unhappiness, but in retrospect demanded re-examination. The children's lives, too, would have been combed through, though they were victims. Schools, routines, known acquaintances. Any sign that someone outside the family circle had fixated on them or crossed paths with them in a threatening way. John List's mother, living under the same roof, added yet another layer. Investigators had to consider not only the dynamics of the younger family unit, but the older generational ties. Inheritance questions, dependence, friction, and emotional burden. Every family under pressure generates rumors after tragedy. People remember odd remarks too late. They retrofit significance onto casual observations. Someone recalls a tense exchange. Another remembers a closed curtain. A third speaks about the father's seriousness or the family's reserve. These memories matter, but they also mislead. An investigator must sort intuition from evidence, grief from fact, neighborhood mythology from usable information. In a community like Westfield, where decorum and privacy had likely masked much of the family's inner life, that task would have been especially delicate. Respectable families often leave behind very little public emotional record. Their difficulties exist in fragments. in subdued impressions, in remarks made carefully and then withdrawn. So the investigation had to work through a paradox. The crime scene suggested intense intimacy, planning, and familiarity. Yet the social world around the family may have yielded only restrained clues, because the family had lived behind the screen of propriety until the screen tore apart. John List, even before he became the obvious suspect, would have stood out as the great unanswered question. Where was he? Why was he gone? Why had he not reported the crime? Why had he left the family home in this condition? Why had he removed himself from the scene in a way that looked less like panic than departure? These are not the kinds of questions a man can answer passively by remaining absent. His absence answers them on its own. And yet, investigators still had to do the work of establishing him not merely as suspicious, but as the central architect of the crime. That meant reconstructing the family finances, his employment troubles, his habits, his mental and religious worldview, his recent movements, any preparations he might have made, any withdrawals, purchases, papers, or arrangements suggesting premeditation. This is the unglamorous center of murder investigation. The public often imagines revelation arriving through one dramatic clue. More often, it arrives through accumulation. Numbers do not match. Dates align too neatly. A man's story collapses because there is no story. A household's pressures point toward the one person who had both motive and opportunity, and who is now conspicuously nowhere to be found. Still, even as the case narrowed intellectually, it expanded geographically. That was the real wound at the heart of the List investigation. Once he fled, the house stopped being the whole battlefield. America became the battlefield. Law enforcement could identify him, circulate his name, push his image outward, and search through conventional channels. But the country was large, and a disciplined fugitive did not need brilliance to evade capture. He needed only steadiness, caution, and the willingness to live a smaller, false life for as long as necessary. John List appears to have possessed exactly those qualities. He was not a flamboyant man who needed attention. He was not driven by the hunger to boast or taunt. He was the sort of man who could reduce himself to procedure, who could become beige on purpose. That is a formidable trait in a fugitive. The very qualities that made him spiritually chilling as a family annihilator also made him operationally dangerous once he disappeared. He knew how to be inconspicuous.